Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Welcome back, everyone, to the latest episode of Riskology by Infortal, where we look at the world of risk, economics, geopolitics, and really anything that can impact your business here in the United States or overseas. And we thought it would be good for this episode, Ian and I, to pause for a little bit here and just think about some of the terminology that we see thrown around in the geopolitical risk space and some of the concepts that are sort of hitting the headlines when it comes to the corporate world and the collection of intelligence. There's kind of a misunderstanding, I think, within the market still in terms of what the collection of intelligence in the private sector can mean and how it can help your business. And I was trying to think of a great example, and one came up actually just yesterday. It was kind of a gift. You know, we were having a virtual coffee with a colleague down in Miami, and we were talking about some of the projects that we've been working on. And he asked a question that I think really frames the issue quite well. And he said, okay, if I'm doing business in a country like Brazil in South America, and let's say I'm looking at different regional or local banks to do business with, which is a requirement in that area, how do I really know who I'm doing business with? Because in this situation, this individual had done business down there, and he knew for a fact that one of the key banks was really up to no good, was really up to some shady business. And a lot of major American corporations were actually using this bank. And so if you think about that question, how can you really understand what the reputation of a company is or what the true situation is like on the ground? And you really need the right type of intelligence to be able to do that. And that's what we want to highlight today, is what that can look like. So Ian, why don't you kick us off and give us the 101 on Intel and sort of the intelligence lifecycle, and we'll start there.
Yeah, great kickoff. And this is a problem that we see repeatedly where a lot of companies, when they hear intelligence, they don't know what that exactly means. So on one hand, you have a lot of people that immediately their brains go to James Bond, corporate espionage, things that are illegal and things that do exist, but things that we actually as a company do not do because corporate espionage is illegal. Or you have companies that think it's something entirely cyber or electronic, or it's like intelligence and big data analytics. And that's also not true, even though we also can deal with some of those problems, depending on what it is. Intelligence is really advanced warning and systematic collection of data. And when we say data here, we don't necessarily mean big data, but big data can only actually get you so far. So if you go back to 2020, there was a company called Fiserv that was actually watching early warning indicators of an outbreak in a city in China called Wuhan. And they started modeling and asking questions, triangulating data that was openly available. They didn't steal any information. And they quickly figured out that there was probably going to be a massive pandemic emerge out of it. So they took the necessary precautions and they recommended against executive travel before the virus actually was even detected in the US, before most governments were actually able to jump on it. And what they were able to do is they were actually able to safeguard their company because they got first mover advantage on the crisis without really taking any serious risks in the sense of losing any foothold. And that is basically the same thing that geopolitical intelligence relates to, and it's the same thing that governments do. But what it is a systematic collection of information, triangulating it to control for failures, and really just eliminating false positives and all sorts of fancy terms like that, where basically you get an advanced warning that allows you and your organization to have an advantage. And that could be moving into a new market. It could be avoiding a crisis. Maybe it's a piece of legislation that threatens your industry. Maybe it's an election that could threaten economic policy changes that could be detrimental to your investments. It could be a war, could be a supply chain issue or third-party risk. It can kind of encapsulate all of those. And you have great examples from that in real life and also from fiction.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the COVID example there. I think a lot of the thinking behind the use of intelligence or the sort of integration implementation of intelligence teams in the corporate sector a lot of times comes from key crisis situations that a company has experienced or maybe a market has hit. And you'll see sort of increased activity and focus on making sure that companies can avoid that type of a situation. But I think what we're starting to see is corporations are looking at this longer term. So, yes, intelligence is very critical and extremely helpful in avoiding crisis and avoiding risks. And that's absolutely a necessary function that larger corporations need in today's markets. But once you truly understand how to utilize intelligence and the collection of intelligence, there's a lot of other use cases which sort of shift away from the crisis side of things and actually start looking at new opportunities. Or if you're jumping into a new market, as we've talked about on this podcast, extremely important that you're actually getting the right intelligence on the ground to know how your investment opportunity is truly going to be received. I think we're starting to see that there's intelligence creeping more and more into marketing and research in terms of how brands will register with the markets, including social media. The information and the open source world of intelligence is growing every day. And so it's important for companies to, one, going back, understanding how to avoid and spot crisis. You have to keep everyone safe. You have to keep your company moving forward, how to spot opportunities, but also how to interpret what's going on in the market because there's so much data out there. You really need an intelligence function. So, Ian, maybe we can hone in on what that would look like for a company. How can a company really integrate intelligence into their day-to-day focus?
Yeah, so to kind of answer that question from the 10,000-foot level, some companies in certain countries are really good at this for different reasons. Japan is taking a more overt approach to intelligence in their private sector, partly because most of Japan's major companies at one point were actually military sort of conglomerates, during the World War II era and before. Israel's good at this, partly because everybody has some sort of security background for the most part. Other companies in other places, they actually work with their actual governments to steal secrets and pretty openly in some cases. But American companies, they kind of have to figure this out as they go because they don't have those same support systems in place, or that's just too far afield from what they're used to actually know. So, where do you put this? How do you gather this information and put it into your company? Your legal counsel is a good place to start in terms of thinking about how to build intelligence capabilities around your business. If you're thinking about trying to inform your executive board, you need to designate one person who can then oversee all the collection and analysis of all that information that you're gathering. So that's sort of the first step. You got to have someone in the top level of your company who can serve as that intelligence officer role or in that capacity, and then can sort of coordinate all the intelligence activities that you're engaged in.
And I think what we've seen, and this comes out through a lot of the conferences and webinars that are held on the topic, is you've really got a place of value that has to be set. The tone has to be set at the top of the organization of why the intelligence function is important, how it's going to work, and how the communication will flow. Where companies have gotten this wrong or where they haven't sort of understood the value and really been able to harness the capabilities that intelligence collection can give you is when there's not a solid line of communication between the group that's collecting intelligence, analyzing intelligence, maybe producing reports, and the decision makers that are closely linked to the strategic decisions that are happening. And as you mentioned, Ian, that could be with the board of directors. You need to make sure that the information is able to get into those hands. And that's not always easy for organizations, particularly larger organizations when they're already stretched thin with, a myriad of compliance needs. But one way of looking at this is intelligence can really accentuate or it can improve a lot of the other functions and groups that you have working. So the compliance teams, as an example, can use intelligence to sort of spot what the direction of the regulatory landscape is going to look like. The marketing teams, as we hit on before, can really utilize intelligence to examine more closely what the true market reception might be for a given situation. And then in terms of key big picture decision making, what are the global markets looking like? We're seeing shifts in the interest rate as we speak. What are those implications going to be for the company longer term in terms of international relations, trade, tariffs, things like that? The more advanced knowledge that you can get on those situations, the better situation your company will be in. So, again, in terms of structure, it can look a lot of different ways. Of course, the size of your organization will dictate how large of an operation you need. There's a lot of service providers that can provide different types of intelligence. So, to figure it out, you've basically got to make an assessment. And we've hit this before, but it all starts with really looking at what is your risk profile looking like today and how does your decision making process work? Once you sort of establish a baseline, then you can look at how to integrate the process teams or key individuals into the organization.
Yeah, no, that's critical. And then to kind of add to that, I think another aspect of this that a lot of companies don't understand or that want to do this or see the value in or the need for it is they don't really assess what their intelligence should be looking at. So geopolitical risks are obvious. And by geopolitical risk, that doesn't just mean war. It can mean things like supply chain disruptions or trade disruptions, like what's going on in the Red Sea. It could be corporate espionage from state owned enterprises that are affecting your industry. So, if you're in a certain industry that has a lot of competitors that are backed by governments overseas, then you're going to be dealing with very different actors. Or even if it's just privately owned competitors, what are they up to any given time? What's going on within your own company? You should actually integrate any security issues that you're detected within your own house. You should be able to integrate those factors as well into an intelligence outlook. And if you kind of think about it cohesively, you can kind of think of the intelligence as looking at the chessboard from up above. You want to see where the timer's at. You want to see where the pieces are moving, the different pieces that are actually being moved. And an executive is not going to have the time to do all of that on their own, not to the detail and ability that an actual intelligence person would do within an organization. So that's sort of their role, is to keep track of all of that and then provide that information to the executive and the legal counsel and the various different department heads within your organization so that they can follow up and potentially address those situations more effectively. So you're kind of looking at all these different things: your competitors, your environment, your legal, and economic situation, all of those things.
Most of the literature that's out there, most of the articles, the webinars, the focus, it's really at the corporate level at the moment. It makes sense in terms of market share, in terms of resources, that a lot of the bigger firms are sort of moving on this first, figuring a lot of this stuff out. But I think it's important too, particularly because we work with a lot of smaller and mid-sized companies, to highlight how intelligence can help your decision making. For smaller companies and mid-sized companies, it's a little bit different. You might not have massive compliance teams. You may not even have an in-house counsel to turn to. And so it may seem that the use of intelligence for decision making or protecting your business is just out of reach. We work with smaller companies and mid-sized companies to really gather intelligence when they're making critical decisions. And I can start with one example. We had a company that was basically doing business mostly in the southeast of the US. And they'd done a little bit of work overseas, but wanted to expand actually in Central America. And so they were looking at some key logistics providers to really make this happen. There's no way they could have done it on their own. They had to go with a third party. And so they had done a lot of the due diligence work. They had done the right things that you want to do when selecting a vendor. But because they were new to the market, they really wanted to make sure that the vendor that they selected was what they thought it was and was a good situation. Well, they hired us to basically do a deep dive to conduct an open source intelligence based review of this company. And we actually discovered that the owner of the company was linked to multiple other companies operating in the region. And through his activities with those other companies, there was actually an open warrant for his arrest in a separate country than they were planning to do business. So they could have unknowingly jumped into this situation, which seemed like a good deal, and started doing business with this company. They could have jumped into that if they didn't have the right intelligence. So, because we were able to conduct an intelligence based investigation and provide the right intelligence, they were able to avoid that risk.
Due diligence and intelligence go hand in hand. When you're looking at de-risking, you have a lot of companies right now that are looking to get out of China because of geopolitical tensions and changes to laws within China. they're looking to go elsewhere. Well, you need to be able to screen who you're working with before you actually jump in there. It's not just based on jurisdiction itself, it's based on who actually you work with in country. So that's where it actually becomes critical to know who you're doing business with and integrate those relationships into your intelligence outlook.
If you're a smaller or mid-sized company, again, that may not have the resources of a large corporation, you can work with an intelligence firm to really conduct a deep dive, intelligence-based review of the situation to make sure that the decision that you're making is the right decision. A lot of times, and we see this particularly with smaller businesses, there isn't always time to sort of conduct the right level of due diligence. You're moving fast, you're making decisions, and you've got to go sort of with your gut. But when you're really making these massive strategic decisions, you really want to trust but verify. You want to dive a little bit deeper to make sure that what you're seeing is actually what's taking place on the ground. And so I think that's a great place for us to pause here. And we look forward to the next episode of Riskology by Infortal.
Thank you.